Hello, I'm Nikki from ChartFlow, and I'm going to be doing today's webinar. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If you can't, or if you have any other problems, go ahead and just put it in the chat, and I should be able to see it. We're going to be talking about how to use an EHR, an electronic health record, to integrate into your EMS program. So this could be anywhere from an EMT basic to a paramedic program at the bachelor level. So you can adapt what we're talking about today to any level and any program that you're using it in. I will be using ChartFlow just because that's the company I work for, and we'll be using our academic EHR, which does have pre-hospital charting in it, including run reports. Some schools I know create their own systems using spreadsheets. You may also have a different program. Any of that is fine. The ideas I'm giving today, you can use with anything that you have. And we'll be talking about just a very basic scenario. We're going to use two examples today. So one would be how to use electronic charting in a skills practice scenario or a simulation. The other one would be how to use it in case review and more of a lecture or a homework setting. So let's go ahead and jump into it. We're first going to talk about how to do this in a skills or simulation setting. And like I said, this can be at any level in any type of program. So if you're a basic EMT program and you use just patient actors, or you have an example, a volunteer from your family come in and that's your patient for the day, and they just lay on the floor and that's how you do your skills practice, that's fine. If you have an ambulance set up where everything is simulated in the back of that ambulance, this is also going to work in that scenario. The only thing that you need to have to integrate charting into that skills practice is some sort of electronic device where your students can access a chart. If you want it to be the most realistic, go ahead and get some sort of tablet, because that's what they will encounter in most big settings. So if you have an urban setting, if you have an EMS crew that's associated with a hospital, they'll almost always have a tablet now. Your students would also be able to access a system like ChartFlow on their mobile devices, so phones. If you have computers in the classroom, anything will work. And how you would set this up is the same as you would set up any skills lab or any simulation. So we have a scenario here, and we'll introduce it to our students before opening the patient chart. So in this case, like I said, everything's going to be easy today. So we have a patient. She called dispatch, and she said that about an hour ago, she put in a casserole in the oven and her carbon monoxide alarm started going off. The sound was so loud that she went in the other room, closed the door. About an hour later, she called 911 because her head was hurting so badly. She attributed it to the loud sound of the alarm. And she also mentioned on that call that her stomach was starting to hurt. Maybe she was getting a stomach bug. And at that point, we and fire were dispatched. So we're going to pull up to the scene. When we do, the utility company has already gotten to the site. They've turned off the gas. And as we pull up in the ambulance, fire and rescue provider is already walking out. The woman is able to walk out with him by leaning gently on his arm, and they approach the ambulance. We help her inside. She immediately lays reclined on the stretcher, and we're going to start the scenario from there. So that's our setup, just like you would set up any other scenario. Let's go ahead and open the patient chart now. When we do this, you'll see that in a scenario where your student is doing the charting, so we're not doing any type of review, they're the one putting in the information as they go through this scenario. The chart's going to be blank. So you're not going to have any information in here already, unless you wanted to put in the complaint as reported by dispatch in here, just as a launching point for your simulation. You could do that beforehand. Otherwise, all of this is going to be filled out. Now, there's a really big benefit to doing this while they're doing their skills or simulation practice. And what that is there's a workflow process that a lot of students don't get to practice until they're in the field. So speaking from personal experience, when I did my EMT training, we never did a full run report. I never recorded a full run report. I never did a full chart by myself when I was in school. We talked about the legal implications of that a lot, and that if there was ever a lawsuit, which there probably would be at some point, your chart is what backs you up in that scenario. But outside of looking at a few examples of patient history, I never had a chance to write this myself, and I never had anyone helping me perfect my report writing. Um, Also, in addition to that, the line between how much medical terminology versus how much do you write in layperson's terms, that's something that you don't get to practice a lot. So incorporating this into the scenario can really help students get comfortable with that. Another thing they can do, so if you look on the left-hand side, I'm clicking into where it says patient complaint and history. When you go into an EHR or any type of charting, you're usually going to have a new entry button, and this is going to pull up a bunch of fields. So you'll notice that although they may have different headers over here, this is very simple or very similar to what you would say when you're teaching like a sample history. So you'll see things like where you would put your symptoms, allergies, last intake. So let's say we asked her and she 2 hours ago, ago, sandwich and water. We can put her last oral intake, any current medication she's on, and we can fill this out. So why this is useful for students at this point is when they are in a real scenario, they have to figure out when are we going to do our charting. And so in this case, this patient comes in and we start talking to her, and she's awake, she's alert and oriented, she knows who she is, when it is, what was happening, how long it's been going on. She is a little bit tired, but she's completely with it. And as we're filling this out, this is a pretty calm scenario. We don't have any blood, we're not resuscitating anyone. So this is a situation where, especially if you have a student who's very tech savvy, they can be typing this in as they're going. So they can be typing in their medications as they ask her those questions, as they go through the history of present illness. If this was a BLS provider, they're probably still using that OPQRST mnemonic, or if you have a paramedic level provider, they're probably putting a lot more description in here based on the relevant information. But as they're filling that out, instead of writing it on a piece of paper, they're probably typing it in here. If you had a scenario that would be very different than this, and they come into a scene, they enter the scene, and on the floor is a patient who has no pulse right now. The only other person in the room is currently performing CPR on them. I am in a team of 2, and what I'm not going to do is open up my tablet and start asking them about the pertinent medical history and recording it. What I'm going to do is make sure that we get that AED, someone starts compressions, we're going to go ahead and work on the resuscitation part of this patient. In this case, we can use our critical thinking skills to recognize that it would be appropriate to be talking to this patient and charting at the same time. So that decision about workflow is something that is really useful to practice before you get in the field, just thinking about how are we going to record this information. The narrative note you see here is usually done at the end of a run, where it's going to be a summary of everything that happened, if there was anything that was refused by the person, any notes, any extra information would all go in here. So I'm going to save this, even though we didn't fill it all out, just so you can see that that information would be saved. But what's really important is when we go into the procedures and interventions, most systems will pull these things out. So what the student or what the eventual EMS provider does is going to be recorded separately, usually, than the patient history. So in here, usually we're going to get a set of vital signs, and we can fill that out. I'm just going to enter one thing in for now, just so you can see how it saves. So let's say her oxygen reading was 99%. If they were doing repeat vital signs, which would be pretty normal, so if they're doing these every 5 minutes, they can go ahead and enter another set of them. They can put the blood pressure, respirations, oxygen, heart rate, blood glucose, anything that's relevant, they can be tracking as they go. And again, if you have a student who maybe isn't as comfortable with technology, they may be writing this down on paper and entering it afterwards. In school is the right time to figure out what you're comfortable with, not when you get in the field and you're trying to juggle your tablet and your med bag and everything else that's going on. There's a Glasgow coma scale here. In this case, we didn't know what was going on right away. It was probably appropriate to put this information in here. Medications. So in this case, if I'm a BLS provider, I would have given oxygen with a non-rebreather, and I could fill that in. If this was a more complicated scenario and we have ALS or paramedics on site, they may be giving medications, in which case the actual like oral or injectables, and they can put in the medication, the dose, the route, and the reaction. So whether it's oxygen or something else, all of that information can be entered here. Procedures, in this case, maybe the person did set up a 12-lead EKG so that they could report that when they arrived at the hospital. That could be in here. If you had a different scenario where the person needed to be intubated, any procedure you do can go in this section. So we have the procedure itself. This is a free-form text field. The field will expand as you type. So if it was something that was really long, you can put all of that in there. The number of attempts, if it was something that you had to try multiple times, if it was successful, and any complications that came because of it. When you fill all this out, we can hit save. And what you'll see, what's really cool about using charting, whatever kind of charting you're doing in your school when you do these labs, is that one, it's a way to record that the student actually completed this skill or this lab. So if you have to report that to either administration or a regulatory body to prove that your students are doing the skills practice that they need to, you will always have this log of information in here of what they did. Additionally, you can grade that if you want to, but what I think is the best part of this is your discussion or your debrief, whatever you want to call it. Anytime we do skills practice, we should always talk about it afterwards, because that's your chance to really fix what went wrong and talk about any concerns the student has. So if I have a student who really just does not know how to get a relevant history, and I come in here and she knows that this patient has a headache, but she got so lost in asking about it. She didn't know if she should be asking if it was radiating or how long it was, or if the person ate cookies today. She just got totally overwhelmed. And we can look at this chart here, and we can talk about, okay, read me your note. Let's talk about how you asked those questions. Would you have done it differently now that you're reading it out loud? How can we rearrange those questions so they make sense next time? Would you like to go in and rewrite your note? So all of that gives them the opportunity to practice those skills. This also gives you the opportunity to remember what happened. So if someone forgot to take the vital signs, you can come in and say, is there anything missing here? Well, I didn't chart the blood pressure in real life. I would have recorded it and taken it. But if your student hadn't have put it in here, why didn't they take it? What were they thinking? Do they recognize that they missed that? All of these questions are good questions, and we want the students to recognize their mistakes without us pointing them out. If they can, that shows that they have the understanding. It's just the practice that we need to hone in. If they can't catch those mistakes on their own, this is our opportunity to do some teaching and some discussing. Okay, so that is a very basic example of how you can use this when you're in your skills or simulation lab. I'm going to go ahead and go back, and we're going to talk about another example that we have in here. So especially when you're working at the higher levels, if you're doing a bachelor's in paramedicine and you have students that are really diving into the meat of different diagnoses, the different pathologies that you might come across, maybe those students are even talking about how you can practice in a hospital setting. Patient review in that case is very useful. Now, I did not build a very complicated patient that would show all of that for this webinar only because we have limited time. I am going to use the same scenario, and we're going to talk about a patient review here. So I'm going to open up a patient chart that already has charting completed on it. But like I said in the beginning, you could do this with any type of scenario. So if we go in here, we're going to see that I already have the run information in here. So we can see, for example, the complaint as reported by dispatch. If we come down, we can see the scene arrival time and also the time that we left the scene. This is a really good field if you ever wanted to discuss scene time, on scene time. Let's say you had a scenario where they shouldn't have been there for 45 minutes, but we can put in the charting that they were, and that can lead to a discussion in class. Why is that? Let's dig into this run a little bit further and see what went wrong and what we can improve on next time. So practicing the skill of thinking about and reviewing these runs is really useful for students to start putting all the pieces together and considering how they can perform their job the best way possible. So in this specific review, we're going to say that the person who did this, the team that did this, were two very new providers. It was a BLS unit. They arrived on site and it was similar to how I described it as we were charting it before. One thing that I would do is say, okay, what are some, I would pull this up on a projector or a smartboard. I may have it in class where students have their phones open and they're looking at this chart with me. They can also do this for homework and we can discuss it the next day. One of the first questions I would ask is, okay, so what are some of the questions that we're going to ask this patient? What are we going to say to them when we first talk to them? Let's go ahead and read the notes and see if this provider asked those questions. Do we have the information we need? So we can read this out loud. Was anything missing here? Did they forget to find any information? Okay, now that we have the information, what would you do if you as the student were on scene? You're going to take some vital signs. Okay, great. Let's see if they did that. Let's go in here. And they did take vital signs. So we can see that blood pressure was 139/89, respiration, oxygen 99, heart rate 130. So we have that information here. That's a good discussion point. Do we notice anything that's abnormal? Maybe a student recognizes that the blood pressure is a little high. Can anyone think of why that might be? So this is our patient that we're looking at. This is our example run. So we don't have to actually be doing the skills to still be using this as a relevant learning tool. If they notice that this blood pressure is a little high, maybe someone says, well, let's see what her normal is. If we go in and look at her past medical history, she has hypertension. She's on medication for it. So possibly that's not something that we really need to think about right now. So let's keep that in mind. We can go back to that vital signs. What would you do next? Maybe they would do the coma scale. Okay, once we have that information, what are some of the interventions that you would have done? Hopefully they'll say giving oxygen, because that would be the obvious one in this case. Well, let's look to see if this team did it. I don't see it. It's not in medications. It's not in procedures. Okay, so they did not give oxygen. Why do you think that would be? And so this would be a case review for your very entry level students, people who are still learning the basic skills. And what we can see is because the oxygen reading, the pulse oximetry reading was 99%, they made the textbook example that hopefully you don't see in real life, where someone did not know that carbon monoxide poisoning can give you a false reading where it says 99%, but because she was exposed to carbon monoxide, she does need that oxygen. So this would be your discussion point. Why do you think that they didn't give the oxygen? If a student recognizes that, oh, why is that not accurate? Why is that something that we need to look out for? Because in carbon monoxide poisoning, the pulse oximetry probably isn't accurate. So things like that are ways to use a chart as in classroom discussion or homework or just general case review where you can simulate reviewing runs and talking about what you can do better next time. It's also a great way to practice professional communication. So, what is appropriate to say in a professional environment? Should we be saying, this guy didn't know what he was doing, they missed this? No. Should we say, well, I can see why this happened. That's why it's really important to remember the different warnings that we've learned. So practicing those communication skills is also part of this. Okay, so we talked about your using this in your skills and simulation labs. We talked about very basic example of how to do patient review or run review in here. And like I said, this can be done on any type of EHR or spreadsheet, whatever you're using. If you're interested in using ChartFlow, we do have about 10 EMS related patients already built in here that you would be welcome to use. And we do have a free student course that has a few activities, somewhere between 5 and 10, I don't remember, where any student, regardless of if your school is using it, can go in and at home, they can practice some of their skills and practice charting those in the same chart that you've seen today. I'll make sure to send anyone who is on this call a link to that. So if you would like to share that with your students, you can. If you did want to use our site, you can always email us and we can set up a call or send you more information. We do also have simulation scenario sheets where you can give them to patient actors and set up your scenarios that way. So that's something you could use if you had ChartFlow. But let's see if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. I don't see any. We will be posting this on YouTube a little bit later today. So if anyone at your school would like to look at this session afterwards, keep your eyes open for that. And like I said, if you have any questions, you can always email us, but I think that covers our session for today and we made it on time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end this recording. Thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you learned something today. Have a good one. Bye.